Jovan, Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to another Lakers postgame reaction show. Just got back from the Chase Center here in San Francisco, where the Lakers beat the Golden State Warriors 118-108 to improve to 25-18. The first time they've been 7 games above 500 this season. So already season best record up to this point. And start the 6-game Grammy trip with an important win that I think sets the tone for this trip, and a trip that, if you look at the rest of the schedule, Lakers should go something like 4-2 or 5-1, depending on if they take care of business and depending on how the rest of the trip goes. I think that's a pretty realistic record. So a lot to touch on. We got Jared Vanderbilt making his season debut. You got LeBron and AD continuing to dominate Golden State's front line. You have LA starting to form this defensive identity. And we now with Vando back, we saw the defensive potential, and he's still a bit of a shell of himself. And even with that, he was very effective tonight. So a lot to be encouraged and optimistic about with the Lakers right now. But you guys know the drill. Before we get started here, for those watching on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this stream. And for those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. So the overarching takeaway for me was LA set the tone for this trip with this win, and they've won 5 of 6 now. And all of a sudden, again, as I mentioned at the top, they are 25-18. They're 7 games above 500 for the first time this season. The 2 prior times they had been 6 games above 500 when they started 10-4, and then when they went 20-14 right after the DFS D'Lo trade. They immediately lost 3 consecutive games after those 2 stretches. Remember, after the 10-4 start, that was the Orlando loss, the debacle with the missed free throws. Then you had the Denver loss, and then you had the Phoenix loss, and then after LA went 20-14, that was when they had the Texas, referred to it, the Texas massacre of the back-to-back losses in Houston and Dallas, and then coming back and losing to the Spurs. So we've seen, like, when LA has been at their peak this season in terms of cumulative success in that reflecting in the record, they've always had a letdown, right? And that's been, LeBron has talked about it, JJ's talked about it, about like this group trying to find some measure of consistency. And I don't want to say that beating Boston and beating Golden State means that they're going to be consistent moving forward and things have stabilized. And like, I think that this group needs to show us over a larger sample size, but I think things are trending in the right direction. And I think we've seen some very serious basketball from this group, and even like in consecutive games, which honestly like hasn't always been the case, especially against better teams. Like they've tended to be, again, relatively serious in like spurts and in every few games or so, especially when they're not playing as well. But I feel like that they've been playing pretty good basketball over the past couple of weeks, and it's been reflected again in them winning 5 of 6. And I think having a chance here with Charlotte on Monday, Philly will be a tough back-to-back depending on who's available there. And then Washington, like they could easily win their next 3 games, stretch that from 5 of 6 to 8 of 9, be on a 6-game winning streak, I believe. At that point, they've won 3 in a row, I think. So, I mean, that would obviously be great. And I think one hallmark of great teams or teams that are aspiring to be great is having great stretches. The Lakers haven't really had a great stretch, and even I would say some of their better stretches earlier in the season have often included a lot of wins against lottery teams or teams that have had injured stars or whatever. And this stretch here, I think with Boston and Golden State, and then later with New York and the Clippers, like I think they really have a chance to have some statement wins and really show that they belong. Again, I keep saying like not in the Boston, OKC, Cleveland tier, but that they should be in that conversation with that next tier. And that's before even factoring in the potential of making a trade between now and the February 6th trade deadline. So in general, I thought tonight was a nice start to the trip. They were shorthanded. Rui Hachimura was a late scratch with a calf injury. Golden State, it is worth noting as well, was without Draymond Green and Jonathan Kuminga. I felt like that really... The Draymond absence really hurt them against AD. Like, in my opinion, and it's been backed up by the numbers through the years, like Draymond is one of the best AD defenders in the league. He has given, I think very few guys can like slow AD down, and AD's gotten the best of Draymond in previous matchups before, but like Draymond is one of the few guys that in like Golden State will let him guard him one-on-one, and he's been able to bother him at times, or certain possessions or stretches or whatever. So I thought they really missed Draymond tonight for that specifically. Of course, his 2-man game with Steph and whatnot. But with all that said, like it just, AD was on a mission. His jumper was falling. He was hitting his floaters. And again, I thought really LA's defense, what was the difference here of Steph went 0 for 8 in the second half. That was, I believe, tied for the worst shooting performance of a half in his career, which is just insane, right? To think about how long he's played and how many theoretically like off nights he's had or off halves he's had. Like the Lakers held him to 0 of 8 shooting, and that was the worst. So I think Max Christie, Gabe Vincent, Austin, like guys who were either primary assignments or switching onto him, did a really good job. So, but that like overarching theme, I would just say in general is like LA's trending in the right direction. I think they got off to the right start. I think sometimes the first game of a road trip can really set the tone for the trip. LA has been a bad team on the road and has really struggled on the road this season. Fun fact, or not so fun fact, this was LA's first road win since Christmas. And part of that is because they have not been on the road a lot over the past month. But it was against the Warriors on Christmas that they last won on the road, and then they lost both Texas games, and they lost to the Clippers. So only 3 road games over that span. And of course, there were some postponements due to the LA wildfires. But LA just, this was a solid win against a solid opponent. They still had Steph. They were at home. They've pulled off some, they've had some good wins without Draymond, to my recollection. And like, this was still like, it's still a tough team to guard with the shooting, the movement, the way they put you in a blender, just the screening and the constant kind of actions in the paint and under the basket. Like it's still a tough team to deal with, at least on the defensive end. Offensively, I felt like LA kind of just did whatever they wanted, but solid win to start the road trip. And again, I think it's a tone setter. To me, stat of the night is plus 20. And that is Dorian Finney-Smith's plus minus. It was a team best plus minus. He continues to lead this group in plus minus. It's a battle between him and Austin since he's been a Laker. Austin was second at plus 17. But Dorian Finney-Smith with Rui out got the start. And first action, first play of the game, they run that grenade action where it's like a double drag with Austin, and then he gets downhill and swings it out or kicks it to the corner with DFS, and he drains a 3. And DFS, his numbers are never going to really stand out. Like tonight, 8 points, 3 rebounds, no steals, no blocks, no assists, hit a couple threes, but he just contributes to winning basketball. He makes just so many little things in terms of rotating, switching, being proactive in those instances, cutting, screening, making the extra pass, running lanes in transition, spacing the floor properly, relocating. And he just does all these things that like I mean, there are some advanced metrics to track some of these things, and you can check how fast a player moves or like how much distance they cover throughout the course of a game and stuff. But like that stuff's not really going to show up in the box score. But I just think DFS, like in my opinion, the cat's out of the bag. Like, we saw what he looked like with the starting group, and I thought it was as good as advertised. Like, I think he should be the starting small forward /4, but whatever position you want to designate him as moving forward. I've talked about it for weeks now that he should be starting over Rui. And tonight we saw, like, they did not really miss Rui. If anything, I think they had a clearer identity without Rui because of how good the defensive wings were for this team, just rotating between DFS, Max, Vando, Gabe, and then it kind of just being like the offensive end is going to be Austin and LeBron handling it, them running 2-man actions with AD, or sometimes 3-man actions, double drag, stack, whatever, horns, and then having the other guys kind of space the floor, but then defensively just having like plus defenders, and really the only weak spots in the rotation were Jackson and Dalton defensively. So I think the Lakers are starting to 4-bit identity, and I'm not saying Rui's fully expendable. I think you have to be you have to be strategic with if you do end up moving him at some point, about who you trade him for, the type of player, what characteristics they have. But I think like Dorian just was a seamless fit with that starting group. You had 2 3-and-D wings next to Austin, LeBron, and AD, and it looked, I think, it, at least in my opinion, it looked as good as I thought it would. And I think that the results were there in terms of their performance with Dorian on the floor. He only played 26 minutes and was a plus 20, and that's just like he's just a winning player. And I think that just, I know like Rui's obviously going to have some bigger offensive performances, but Dorian's on and off ball defense and just ability to complement LeBron and AD in that sense is like, it's a night and day difference. And I think it really has this compounding effect with the rest of this group. And then deeper into the rotation as you start to do the various lineups. Like you saw, Dalton was came in earlier because there was no Rui. And you could kind of envision Rui being in that spot as like the offensive wing /forward coming in and providing a boost. That I think should be Rui's role moving forward. But we'll see. JJ said he's day to day, but we'll see what ends up happening with that. But that to me, like the plus 20, and honestly, that was my first takeaway. So I kind of just blended the two. But takeaway number one for me, and just going to continue that. Like, I think Dorian Finney-Smith should continue to start. I thought we finally saw what it looked like. It took an injury to Rui, unfortunately for him and for the group. But now that we saw it, I think like JJ has to be honest and go back and look at the film and look at the numbers since DFS has been there. And it's just like, he's outplayed Rui. The lineup data has supported that. The eye test has supported that. And again, he's not, Rui can, like, I thought Rui was pretty solid against Boston, and he's going to have the nights where he scores 10, 15, 18 points, grabs 5, 7, 8 rebounds, but he's also going to have nights where he doesn't do those things. And I think the off-ball defense in particular, when you put that next to LeBron, there can be a compounding effect negatively. And Dorian's just like, he can switch on to a Steph Curry, but then he could also guard an Andrew Wiggins. And then if you need him to switch on to a Trace Jackson Davis, he can do that. Like he can switch across multiple positions, multiple types of players, and largely hold his own. Rui, it's he can do some switching, obviously, and LeBron, AD, and Rui typically do switch across the front court. But I just think there's far more you have far more margin for error with DFS out there compared to Rui. So just as a continuation of the stat of the night, to me, it was just seeing what DFS looked like out there, what he looked like out there, also next to like Vando and Max and Gabe, and like they played some defensive lineups. They played Vando as a small ball 5. So I just think the optionality, like adding DFS and Vando in, as we've talked about in recent weeks, I do think makes Rui relatively expendable. There's, of course, some risk with Vando about his health and how he's going to be moving forward. But I just think if you look at it almost as, if you move forward with AD, LeBron, DFS, Max, and Austin as your foundation, that's your starting lineup. And then it's like, what pieces can we plug in there? if you have Vando, you have another wing size guy. He can play anywhere between like 3 and 5 off the bench. Gabe, honestly, I've been trending more toward, if I have to pick between keeping one of Gabe or Rui, I'm actually leaning more toward Gabe with the way that he's been playing. But I think that's relatively close there. Like on the whole, of course, I think Rui is the better player and has played better this season. But I do think Gabe is like, I thought he did a great job against Steph tonight and really was able to bother him and like was making screening for Steph tough and fighting over it. And like you saw, Gabe just continues to play better and better on both sides of the ball. And then I just look at like Dalton, Jackson, and Rui. If those guys are coming off the bench, like those are some of the spots I would try to upgrade in the rotation, which to me is like another wing and another big, as I've talked about several times on here. Could still probably use another playmaker, ball handler, but so far they've largely been able to get by with Austin and LeBron running a lot of the offense. But I guess to kind of tie this all up, I think we saw a preview of what this group could look like without Rui, and I thought they largely did not miss him and were fine. And it was just more like, okay, Dalton, you take some more shots. You be that off the bench scorer. AD and LeBron, of course, carried a lot of the load offensively. There's going to be some nights where they don't do that as much, but I don't think they really missed the beat. And I think that's a credit, again, to DFS, to Max, to Gabe, those guys stepping up. Vando coming in, making a difference. And speaking of Vando, takeaway number 2 is Jared Vanderbilt makes his season debut and looks pretty good for a guy who missed a year. And there was certainly an element of rust. Like after the game, he talked about just getting his win back. JJ talked about it. LeBron talked about it. Like they all kind of acknowledge he's not right where he wants to be or needs to be conditioning wise, which is understandable. That's part, it's par for the course. He only played 12 and a half minutes tonight. So JJ had talked about in the past wanting to start him at around 10, and that the key leading into him playing and then moving forward over like the next week or two is going to be progressively ramping him up in terms of his conditioning and then continuing to play him a little bit more incrementally. So Vando comes in 12 and a half minutes, checks in at the 9:30 mark of the second quarter. And immediately you see like defensively, he's pressuring guys. He's switching across multiple positions. He's rotating. He just has this energy and this verve and this motor that a lot of this group, I think it can be contagious when there's a guy out there like that. But in general, like we've seen with the Lakers, when the Lakers don't look good, a lot of it comes down to like sometimes they just go through the motions and the low man isn't rotating and they're not boxing out and they're not rotating and scrambling defensively in general. And against Boston and against Golden State, we've seen this team execute the defensive game plan at a high level. I thought there were times like there was one play in I want to say it was the third quarter where Steph targets Dalton Connect, and so he's being guarded by Max, and he has I forgot who Dalton's man was, but he has Dalton's man come up. They switch that because the Lakers switch 1 through 4, and Dalton's on Steph, and all of a sudden Austin comes running up from his man in the corner to double Steph, and then LeBron rotates over to the corner and covers Austin, and like that was a perfect example of all of a sudden Steph gets a double team. He kicks the ball back out, and you saw like Steph was trying to attack Dalton, get him one-on-one, and then probably hit a step back 3 in his face. And Austin counters that by doubling, and then LeBron rotates over, because sometimes what would happen in the past and will happen, I'm sure in the future at times, is like if Austin does that rotation over to double, no one rotates over to the corner guy, and then Steph just hits that guy in the corner. That guy gets an open 3. Like we've seen the Lakers try to counter things, and then they don't do the like. It's a counter, and then it's another counter, and then you got to keep like. And then okay, so now you have 3 or 4 guys on that side of the floor. Well, maybe there's like 3 Warriors on the other side, and then you got to rotate back over. So like defense is hard work. It's constant rotating. It's constant scrambling. And I think the Lakers have done a better job of being proactive defensively, but also with the scrambling, the switching, and just like playing smart defense in a lot of ways. And as the group has said all season, they need to be a team defense first, and that starts with being like doing proactive things like scram switching and doubling and rotating over. Like some of it's basic, but they haven't done it consistently. So to bring it back to Vando, I thought Vando just amplified all of that, and you saw the group, like especially when he was out there, play with a certain energy that I think is rather contagious from him. But he did a lot of like really subtly important things. So again, like the switching was important, and just the way he was covering ground defensively, but offensively, that was the biggest concern for me and for I think the Lakers entering this was like, how is he going to look offensively? Because we know he's been played off the floor in the playoffs, even in regular season games, he's been played off the floor. But similar to right before he got injured against Boston, JJ used him more around the elbows in the middle of the floor. And he used him as a screener, as a passer, and as a cutter around the elbows, around the slot. And what that does is it's harder to cheat off a guy in the middle of the floor. And if you do, that's where Vando is cutting in he didn't get a cut for like a layup tonight, but we saw it previously before he got injured. But you also saw like Golden State putting smaller guys on him. It was often Schroeder or Pajemski or Gary Payton. Like they would hide a smaller defender on him and have that guy rotate. But then you saw Vando be able to crash the offensive glass. And Vando, it was clear, like his crash rate, I'd love to know tonight. It must have been like 80%, 70%, something wild, because it was basically anytime another Laker shot, like Vando was wherever he was on the floor, running as hard as he could toward the rim to try and get an offensive rebound. And he ended up with 2 offensive rebounds. He had a tip in early and 4 rebounds overall, but had 2 assists. So I mentioned him being used as a screener and a roller and a passer in the middle of the floor. Had a nice side pick and roll with Austin, with empty corner, and he gets downhill slightly, just kind of takes a dribble toward the free throw line, sprays the ball out to DFS in the weak side corner. DFS hits a 3, and that was a big shot in a big play. And it just showed like you have to be careful with where you put him, because there was a couple times like he took a corner 3 that almost airballed, barely grazed the rim, and that's where LA has to be careful in terms of how they use him. And his spot up rate and catch and shoot rate was higher under Darvin than it previously was in Utah and Minnesota and earlier in his career. So you got to be careful with putting him in the corner and just letting teams sag off of him, because that's exactly what Golden State did. If he's in the corner, he's going to be ignored. But if you put him in the middle of the floor, you can, like, Vando grew up playing point guard and on the ball, and he's not like a point forward, but you see the ball handling skills, especially in like quick bursts where he can rip through from a triple threat position and attack and make a quick pass, make a quick play. And that is something that a lot of guys with his profile of like plus defenders that are offensive liabilities don't necessarily have. So I think there's like a skill and playmaking element to Vando that the Lakers can still kind of tap into and unlock. And I thought we saw glimpses of it tonight. So of course it was only 12 and a half minutes. And I think theoretically, like he will ramp up to 15, 18, 20. And then I'm not quite sure how big his role will ultimately get, but 3 steals as well. Like he did a really good job. So it was actually after the pass to DFS in the corner, he blew up a pick and roll. I forgot who the ball handler was, but they tried hitting a pocket pass to, I believe it was Looney. He steals it, and then he ignites a fast break, and I think LeBron gets like a dunk or a layup. So you just saw like the impact on both sides of the ball. LA, I've been talking about it as we've been ramping up for Vando to come back. I've talked about it ad nauseum. I was saying JJ is going to use him as a small ball center. He is going to use him like those small ball lineups of LeBron, DFS, and Rui. It's going to be Vando in there instead of Rui, and that's what we saw tonight. Maybe we'll see some variations with Rui in there as well. But the LeBron, DFS, Vando lineup, I actually did like, because Vando is a much better defender than Rui. He's a better rebounder, and he just covers more ground defensively. So I thought those lineups and Golden State is a group you can go small against. And remember, if you go back to the Christmas game, LA out small balled Golden State in that game. because remember, AD went out 7 minutes into that game. So they ended up playing a lot of LeBron and Rui at center, and they were able to, and Draymond, if I'm not mistaken, played in that game. So, or it's my recollection he did. And like it didn't matter. Kaminga, I think, might have as well. So like they were at full strength, and LA was still able to beat them without AD on Christmas. So I think this is clearly an advantageous matchup for the Lakers. Like, I think if they play Golden State in a playoff series, they're winning it probably in 5, maybe in 6, like 2023, but I would lean toward 5. Like, I just think this is a team that the Lakers have solved. They defend Steph well, or relatively well. They just pound them in the paint. They have a size advantage, and they do a really good job of just physically overwhelming them. I think you saw that. But to tie up the bow with Vando, like, I just think he came in, he made an impact. I liked how LA used him defensively. I mean, offensively, of course, defensively, but he seemed to be ahead of schedule. Like, even he admitted he felt that he was better than he expected. JJ was like, I feel like this dude's been sandbagging it in practice and like our stay ready groups, because he's gone like 50% at this level. And I was kind of concerned almost, like, was he going to be able to come in, and like how much could he play and how is he going to perform? But like, Vando just comes in and is flying all over the court and like is playing with the most energy of anybody. So I thought the Vando like 2 shifts went about as well as expected, or as possible, not as expected. I didn't really have expectations, and I think I was pleasantly surprised, as were the Lakers. So I thought Vando's debut, he's going to continue to play more, and I think he's going to continue to become more valuable to this group. I still think that there's a whole question about like his playoff usage and just depending on the opponent, what his utility and value is in that hypothetical series, but that's a conversation for later in the season. Third and final takeaway, and I'll keep this one relatively brief before we get into the Q&A. I think, as I mentioned earlier in the show, and this has been a topic for probably over a month now, especially post DFS, is like this group's identity has been evolving, and they've been trying to figure out what their identity is. And there are nights where we've talked about, like, there's stretches where LA is like a top 10 offense, bottom 10 defense, top 10 defense, bottom 10 offense. They can't really put it together on both ends of the floor, but it does feel like over the last couple of weeks, they're starting to settle on an identity. And the identity is similar to 2020 in a sense, not entirely, but similar to 2020. It's like, we are going to lean on LeBron and AD offensively. In this case, now Austin is a part of that trio as a big offensive piece. We're going to lean on those 3 guys and just put spacers and shooters and like not really even a secondary ball handler. I guess Gabe is like the closest, but like guys who can get out in transition, guys who just complement them well and can execute the offense that we're trying to run. But it's primarily going to be a lot of 2 and 3 man actions with LeBron, Austin, and AD, unless we're getting out in transition. And like that's the offensive identity. And it is going to be some lower scoring performances. This is not a team that's routinely putting up 125, 130 like some other teams. Relatively low 3-point volume. And even free throw shooting has not been as high in terms of volume as previous seasons. But they get it done with the shot making between LeBron, AD, and Austin. And typically one of those 3 has it going, is capable of going for 25, 30 plus, and has an advantageous matchup against the defender. Then defensively, it's going to be a couple of looks, right? So you have AD, and depending on the matchup, kind of how you deploy him. Is it 1 through 5 switching? Is he in drop? Is he up to touch? You have different ways to use AD. But then you're putting, as JJ likes to say, banshees out there of Dorian, Gabe, Max, now Vando, and previously Cam, and Jackson. Plays a little bit more mobile coverage defensively. He's a guy that the Lakers like to blitz with or play up to touch and not necessarily be in a drop, because in a drop he can be taken off the dribble, scored on, drawn a foul or whatever. But you're starting to see this identity form, and then you have the small ball lineups where you go with the three wings, and then you're switching everything, and you're just trying to create chaos. They've been mixing in some zone. JJ said like the last 3 games they played the most zone they played all season, and that's been intentional. That they are trying to implement this 2-3 zone and figure out a way to at least have it be a look that they can go to later in the season in big games in the playoffs for shifts or stretches of quarters, whatever. So long story short, like I think the identity that's starting to form here, and I think the identity that should inform the front office of the next move is LeBron, AD, Austin, and a bunch of two-way athletes around them. And two-way is a sort of we'll use that term broadly because you could argue like DFS Gabe and Vando trend far more defensively than offensively. Like DFS and Gabe have shot the ball well. I mean, you could throw Max in that group as well. Like they shoot the ball well, but outside of that, those guys aren't really like they're not shot creators. They're not really like hitting pull-up jumpers or even really attempting them. And they're far more like finishers than creators. Then you have Vando, who's I think has some utility offensively, but in general, still like teams are going to put their worst defenders, their smallest defenders on him. And then you got some guys in there where like, if AD wants a better center, it's clearly not Jackson Hayes. And then Dalton doesn't really fit in. Like, I think that the defense has been better the last couple games, but there's still breakdowns and times there were several possessions of the Boston game that were just egregious, and he got yanked after he let Sam Hauser just walk into an open 3. And then Rui's the other guy where it's like there are nights Rui's defense looks better. In general, it's very inconsistent, and I would say largely subpar. And I think if you can flip that asset into a more consistent defender, either in the front court or just another wing, all of a sudden, I think you have the horses to really just play a top 8 that makes a lot of sense. That you're kind of playing the same types of players around LeBron, AD, and Austin. You're just shifting in new ones that obviously every player is different, so there's going to be some certain strengths or weaknesses within certain lineup configurations. But like, I think it's just kind of going back to the 2020 model of let's put as much size and athleticism and defend and just defense around LeBron and AD, and then now Austin as like a big part of it. So I think as the Lakers move forward and try, like I think you could have made a case at the beginning of the season, which I made and others made, about them leading more into the offensive end, and even recently and this is where I think the Rui conversation is so fascinating, because if Rui is a big part of this team, I think there's a defensive ceiling. If Rui is a smaller part of this team or not on this team, I think that like I don't think there's a coincidence that tonight they defended as well in this specific matchup without Rui. With Boston, they're a little bit more stagnant offensively. So as long as Rui can stay in front of a Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, like you're kind of fine. Like Golden State is a lot of back cutting and back screening, flares and pin downs and all that stuff. So like there's a lot more confusion with them in terms of how they run their offense. And I think that's the type, like this is the type of team that Rui can struggle with defensively. Though to his credit, he did hold up well, I thought, on the Christmas game. So we'll never know how he would have performed tonight. But I just think it's as LA kind of forms this identity, I think that should, again, inform the front office of how they should, what type of swing or swings they should take between now and the trade deadline. And I think it should just be more size, athleticism, and defense. And of course, with a requisite level of shooting, you don't want just like a bunch of non-spacers out there. But that, I think, is just something to file away, whether it's replacing Gabe with a bigger defender or replacing Rui with a better defender. I think either way, like those are the two paths to doubling down on what this team is already doing well. And then kind of like the offensive end, you're going to be fine ultimately with LeBron, AD, and Austin. As long as you have some shooting around them, I think you can figure it out. So with all that said, let's get into the Q&A. I see we got a bunch of super chats, so let's get into it. First one from IS. LA has to pry Miles Turner from Indy for Rui if serious. That I think is the type of trade I'm talking about. That gets you the AD big. It's a guy who can space the floor. It also can protect the rim at an elite level. I'm not quite sure what that package looks like. I think it would probably be a first. So Miles Turner is making 19 point something. So it's probably Rui, JHS or Christian Wood, like some type of minimum type contract, a first and something else. I don't think LA does 2 firsts for this trade. I don't even know if they would do a swap. Like maybe it's a first and a second, something like that. I think gets you in the conversation. Now, I've already been aggregated on the Miles Turner stuff from yesterday. All I said, and as I've heard, that there's he might be available because of the contract situation. He is expecting a big payday this summer, and he's expiring, and Indiana isn't sure whether they want to pay him. So there is a chance that if, depending on how that situation looks over the next couple of weeks, he could be available, and I think sneakily available, because I don't think it's going to be just like a fire sale of. But he's a guy that's been in trade rumors, and they've been trying to trade for years. He's a guy LA's been attached to for years. So if he does become available between now, and he might be available right now, I think LA, like that is the exact. I've said it numerous times. If you were designing a big man in a lab to put next to Anthony Davis, like this version of Anthony Davis, it is Miles Turner, because he gives you the JaVale McGee, Walker Kessler type rim protection. He's not. Kessler's a better rim protector, but gives you the shot blocking, gives you the rim protection, but then also gives you the floor spacing. And one weakness with him is he's not a strong rebounder, but putting that next to AD, like that can kind of, like JaVale wasn't a strong rebounder. He was a good offensive rebounder, but like in general, defensive rebounding wasn't like dominant at that, the way like a Kessler is or a Gobert or whatever. So Turner, like that's a weakness, but I think AD complements that really well. So I love the Miles Turner fit. I've loved it for years. And I think if he is available, and that is something that's like quietly kind of happens, then yeah, I think Rui and a first, and probably something else, though not a second first, is probably the price. Shabugan. So you got aggregated again. Could you clarify this Miles Turner stuff? Given their 5th in the East and playing well, is he actually available? So I just touched on it. I said at the time, if you go back and listen to it, this is where context is important. And if you see the aggregations, they're like the first, they quote me on one line of like, I've heard Miles Turner might be available. And then there's like the ... and that ... is cutting out a lot of the context of what I was saying. But I heard from a league source that Indiana might kind of sneakily be open to trading Miles Turner. That was not, I said then, and I'm saying it now again, that was not in direct relation to the Lakers. It was kind of just talking trade market, like which guys are available, and going through various players. But it was not like Lakers, Pacers have had talks, or Miles Turner is a legit option for LA. It was just kind of shooting the breeze on is this guy available? Is this guy? And then that was a name that popped up, and that was something that was relayed to me. So again, to kind of go back to the previous question, if he is available, I think LA needs to pursue that and needs to be aggressive with it, because if they can get him or Walker Kessler, I think both of those guys are like perfect fits for different reasons next to AD, and would really amplify a lot of what LA is trying to do. The advantage for Kessler is, again, you could probably pull it off with just JHS. You have to give up a lot more draft capital and almost all your assets. And that's like the drawback. But with Turner, you do have to give up Rui. That's a big part of your rotation. Even if I was just talking about like they looked fine without Rui, like still, of course, Rui on average has been their 4th or 5th best player this year. So I'm not gonna like deny that they could miss him if they end up trading him. But if you get Turner, you're getting another, you're maintaining size, you're actually getting bigger, and you're getting another guy who can space the floor at that front court position, but then also protect the rim at a really, really high level and man the defense when AD's off the floor. So I think that would be a no-brainer. So Again, just to reiterate, the most simple form, I've heard Turner might be available. And so you referenced the record. It's specifically just basic contract situation of he is about to be a unrestricted free agent, and he's going to want 30 plus million. And I've heard Indiana is not sure if they want to give him 30 plus million. So if they don't, then from an asset management perspective, it makes sense to trade him and get something back for him. However, the one thing with that is they already traded for Thomas Bryant because they weren't happy with the backup center situation and just being decimated in the front court at times. So I think the one thing from the Lakers side that could make this complicated, aside from the previous talks with them and all the noise and whatever, is just I think Indiana might want to try and get another center if they trade Turner. And in that case, obviously LA doesn't have a center to trade. So that would be a complicating factor potentially. Rola, thank you for the super chat. What should the Lakers do? Trade Rui / JHS / a first rounder for Miles Turner, or 1 first and JHS for Kessler? Let's go, yo. Between the two, so I have revised my trade targets list that's going to be coming out next week. Tentatively, I think it's coming out Wednesday. And I still have Kessler above Turner, and there are multiple reasons why. One, he's younger. He's still 2. He's still on his rookie deal, so he's cost controlled for at least 1 more year. But then even rookie extension, like it could be a better number than Turner. Like I have less concern about where Kessler is in 3 or 4 years than where Turner is in 3 or 4 years. Like one legit thing I've talked about it on here before, but we do have to, like, Turner's numbers have been a bit worse this year compared to last year. And it could be the situation. It could be, guys ebb and flow, especially role players like throughout their career. But if he's on the downturn, there is some risk obviously from LA. If they trade for him. Kessler's 23, like he's on the upswing. He's several years away from his prime. So I think between potentially not having to give up a rotation player, his age, the contract, and Kessler, I've been doing some film deep dives, and like just watching his film, it's like this dude is. I watched him defend Jokic, and yes, Jokic still got him sometimes. I'm like he's going to get anybody, and he still got him with the body. But Kessler is so tall and so long and has such a large standing reach that he blocked Jokic a couple times defending him in the post. And like we've seen AD do that occasionally, and Jokic will still get the best of AD. But I just think having that guy handle the centers and have AD being the roamer and the helper. We saw it in the Boston game with putting Rui on Porzingis and then having AD roam and cause chaos. Like now imagine that. Imagine if Kessler was on Porzingis and then you had AD doing that. Like it's just, that's the next level of the Lakers defense. So I would still lean Kessler. The one complication or the one way I would lean Turner would just be ultimately like price. Like if Utah's like, we want 2 firsts and Dalton Connect, like, and remove the 1 through 4 protection in 2027. I think that's too much for Kessler. And if Indiana is willing to do like 1 first for Turner, I don't know if I agree with like that big of a gap between them from an asset perspective. But factoring in just the context of everything, I would lean more toward Kessler, one of the best offensive rebounders in the league. I think actually might be statistically the best, one of the best rim protectors in the league. And like, I think is basically like a supercharged kind of a hybrid of like JaVale and Dwight in some ways, like some of the JaVale finishing, offensive rebounding, blocking shots, and then some of the Dwight like physicality and like kind of being that threat from the dunker spot, and just being a guy you could put on, as the primary defender on a bunch of bigs. So I lean Kessler. I think he's a much better rebounder, and I think overall better defensively. He's more mobile than I think people give him credit for. So I lean Kessler, but again, depending on the price, you could make an argument for Turner. Hale Ford. Hey, Jovan, are Lakers Are Lakers getting better, especially with Vando back, Rui, JHS, and Wood for Bruce Brown? Connect, remove protections on 27 first for Kessler. What do you think? I mean, if you could get Bruce Brown without giving up any picks, like I would do that. I would assume they'd want. I think Bruce Brown is probably going to go for 2 or 3 seconds, or like at the most, maybe like a protected first. So I think that package would probably be too low for Toronto. And then I think that like Utah is going to want. I would be shocked if Utah accepted anything outside of a first plus another asset for Kessler. In this case, I think you're trying to replace that first with Dalton, but I think they're going to want, especially if it's the Lakers and just like the context of the Lakers assets, I think they're going to want the 2029 or the 2031 as like a starting point, and that's probably even too low. And then Dalton or the second pick or a swap or removing the protections or some combination of that. So I think that's probably fair in the fair ballpark for Kessler, but I think Utah wants way more than that. And anytime there's a negotiation, obviously someone could go up a little bit more, someone could go down a little bit to kind of meet in the middle. But I think that's way too below what Utah wants to be realistic, in my opinion. RGN Cal 4, trade a first for Vucevic, Kobe, and Craig for Rui, Gabe, and JHS. I have been thinking more about the Bulls guys in terms of White and the Sunmo, and would those guys be worth trying to just see if you can pry and their potential fit? From a money standpoint, you're close. I think you might have to throw in one more contract, maybe a minimum from LA side. I think I would do that. I might honestly, this might be crazy, but I might prefer the Sunmo over Kobe White. I know Kobe White's like technically the better player, but I think especially if you're adding Vucevic, I'd rather add a stronger perimeter defender. You are adding Torrey Craig, but I don't think like Torrey Craig is not better than Dorian Finney-Smith. He's not better than Max Christie. I don't think he's better than Jared Vanderbilt. So maybe he's like your break in case of emergency, like 10th, 11th man, but I don't think Torrey Craig's really playing for this group. It's basically Vucevic and Kobe White, and I don't really want to add like 2 non-plus defenders. So I would actually try to swap that for DeSumo, and maybe you don't even have to give up that fourth minimum guy, but you might have to give up. I think Chicago would want more assets, to be honest, but I would maybe do like a first and a second, but I don't think I'd go above that. Raymond Rivera, Vando elevates his team to another level. He's also humble. He's also a humble and great person. Wore a great sweater tonight. I don't know if you guys saw it. It was a brownish tan with what's the it's not mole hair. This shows like whatever that furry fabric is. But yeah, it was a cool sweater with like a light blue stripe, forearm to elbow. Yeah, I mean, you said it. Thank you for the super chat. But he's does elevate this team for sure. I think there's still going to be some playoff questions, but again, that's months away. Rolla, again, great to see Vando covering defensive weaknesses of Dalton. Like that's another thing. So I think looking at like I've talked a lot about plus minus and how sometimes it can be misleading, sometimes it can be intuitive and reflective of what's going on. And I thought interestingly tonight, Lakers played basically 9 guys. Koloko got in there for the final 24 seconds of garbage time. But of the 9 guys, 7 of them had positive plus minuses. The only 2 that did not were Jackson Hayes and Dalton Connect. And coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, those are the 2 worst defenders in this 9-man rotation that played tonight. So I think, again, there's seems to be a correlation of like LA's better defensive lineups and better defenders and not translating more to just better basketball. So and Jackson played a little bit with AD, so it wasn't fully like non-AD minutes. AD ended up playing 36 minutes. Jackson, I want to say they share. It was a pretty quick shift. I want to say it might have been like a minute or two, but they had that lineup of Jackson, AD, LeBron, Dalton, and Gabe. I want to say that was like end of the first quarter, similar to the one that played against. It was the same lineup that played against the Clippers, had some success. But to your point, I think Vando does cover up some of Jackson and Dalton and just like their weaker defenders' weaknesses. I think you got to be careful. I still think the Lakers had some of the lineups. Like I still don't love Gabe and Max together. I think throwing Vando into that, and like I wouldn't like a second unit lineup of like Jackson, Vando, LeBron, Gabe, Max. I fear that could be the lineup we see at some point. I don't really like. You still have to try and balance it on both sides, but yeah, I mean Vando allows I think Dalton to play a bigger role, and again, I think when Rui's healthy, Rui can take the Dalton role, and he is a better defender than Dalton. He's bigger, he's more physical, he's a better rebounder, but you kind of saw the blueprint for like what this could look like. Shabugan, unfortunately, this game proved that Rui's role going forward is salaried and trade for someone who fits the team needs more. Yeah, and now the one thing I want to like reiterate is I think we probably want to see a bigger sample size from Vando. Just makes like even tonight there was one play where he got like a Charlie horse or something, and like he was kind of gimpy for 10, 15 seconds. And you just got to remember, like, his injury history is extensive. He is coming off missing nearly a year. I think Rui is expendable within adding DFS and a healthy Vando. If Vando has a setback or gets injured again or whatever, like that changes the dynamic of this roster. And I do think Rui becomes more important unless you replace him with like a Rui plus something for Cam Johnson. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, you're replacing him with a wing or Bruce Brown, Lonzo are more like big guards rather than wings, though Bruce Brown can play the wing. So it kind of depends on like who you replace Rui with. But that's just one note I want to be clear on is like, if Vando's healthy, yes, I do think, and I've been saying that, I felt like it was trending this way that Rui was going to be expendable, but it is predicated on Vando being healthy, and we're one game in. I think it's something we need another like week and a half on. And even then we won't really know if he'll be healthy the rest of the season, but at least like, I think you probably got to get it closer to the deadline to really know like, okay, it's been almost 2 weeks. He's still healthy. Like, how's he recovering? That's more of like an internal thing that only the Lakers will really know, but let's see where he's at like a week and a half from now. And then I think can kind of finally make that call as to like how expendable Rui is. Eeg, thank you for the super chat. Any guess on price for Miles Turner? That's quite the get. I think it's going to be a first plus another asset. Be it young player, second round pick, swap, something like that. Like what? So the tough thing with talking trade assets is like there's always two. There's two like values, I would say, right? So there's like kind of in a vacuum, like how does the league view this player and just their general value? And if you're trying to make a trade for this person, like what's kind of like a realistic like price point or range you'd be willing to give up in terms of assets. Then there's the context within actual negotiations between trades, and certain teams value certain players or contracts more. I think this is where LA trading D'Lo really limits their ability to get higher paid players, because right now, like let's just say you swap Rui in instead of D'Lo and you had D'Lo on this team. Of course, the team would be much different, but just from a contract perspective, let's say, or you just swap the contract. So D'Lo had Rui's contract. Rui has D'Lo's contract. You swap those. So Rui is at 18.7 million expiring. You're almost right there exactly with Miles Turner. So you do have to put in one more contract, but you're pretty close. But Indiana views those contracts totally different because D'Lo is an expiring. Rui has one more year. So you have to factor in, if you're Indiana, what do we think about Rui? Do we like him? Like, how do we rank him within our front court? Because also Indiana's a team that has a lot of forwards, and they have a guy in Jarris Walker who they're trying to develop they're trying to find minutes for. So you have Mathurin, you have Neesmith, you have Obi Toppin. They're trying to trade him. You have Turner, you have Siakam, obviously. So like there's a bit of a logjam with Indiana and their front court situation. So if anything, you have Ben Shepherd. So really like 2.5 to 5 that or 4.5, whatever, like spots in their rotation. They have a bunch of guys who are relatively interchangeable and all bring like different things to the table. So I think where Rui fits into that, like I would probably put him somewhere in the middle of that group, though honestly, maybe like middle lower. And so I don't know how Indiana like, and then again, you have to factor in he's got one more year. So I do wonder if like there could be the price for Turner, and then there could be the price for Turner based on the contract you are offering. So if they don't love Rui, they don't love his fit, they don't love that he has an extra year, it could be, well, we value Turner as a first and a second, but now that you're giving us Rui, we want to swap, or we want both seconds. So I think that's where like there's not of course there's like a hard and fast ultimately like what the value is if you make a trade, but in these types of conversations, like there's a lot of context, there's a lot of moving parts, and again, I think there's kind of two answers where there's like the general league consensus on what a player is worth, and then the context within the negotiations between the two teams in terms of what are you offering, how do we value that player, how do we feel like that player fits in. And that's where I think it gets a little bit tricky with Rui and ultimately LA not having a center. Like if Rui was 7 foot, he'd be a different player. But I think Indiana might be a little bit more interested to take him back just because of they need a center if they trade Turner and are trying to be competitive. So hope that kind of answered your question there. Eeg again, LBJ season management effort plan has rubbed off on AD due to year 13, superstardom, injury history, and a playoff preservation. It's all good with me, but the effort variance game to game, AD is low-key hilarious. Thoughts? I have noticed it does feel like AD's effort has maybe waned a little bit at times this year. Like I've said it, I think the defensive slippage has been there. Like if you look at it, when I was grading him on my midseason report card, I don't know what it is currently, but like his rim protection in terms of defensive field goal percentage allowed at the rim was 4% lower this season compared to last season up at the midway point. And on paper, the Lakers have better defenders this year than last year. Remember, like last year, I mean, Cam had the nice stretch, but like it was a lot of the starters, which was Rui, Austin, D'Lo, and like that was not a great defensive lineup. But then you had Dorian, and like they didn't have a great backup center situation still. And then you had Spencer and Gabe later in the season, but like it wasn't comparing that to DFS Max, the way that he's been defending, a healthy Gabe, the way that he's been defending Vando now that he's going to be back. Like I think this is a much better defensive, and I think they've taken out some of the lower, like D'Lo and some of the lower floor guys are also out. So I think like this group's defensive ceiling. And so my point with that was just like, in theory, 80s, you can't really blame the supporting cast for 80s defense dropping 4% at the rim. I think that's more of like an AD thing. And I think even tonight, there was a couple times where guys went right at him, like Wiggins, and like scored over him. And part of that's just like sometimes great offense beats great defense, or good offense beats great defense, whatever. But I feel like guys have been challenging AD more than they have in the past. However, we saw in the Boston game, I think we saw for stretches tonight, and we've just seen in general at times this season, like when AD is fully locked in, revving like 100% motor, 100% awareness and focus, like he's arguably the best player, best defender in the world, and in the best player conversation, clearly top 5 when he's at that level. So I would say like the biggest areas sometimes for him are or his transition defense. That's kind of been a pretty big weakness of his over the last few years. Is like part of it sometimes he falls, but sometimes you see like him going from under the paint back to the other side of the floor. It's like a trot. Not sure what this bubble popped up, but I don't know if whatever. So yeah, I would say that there's certainly some effort fluctuation with him, and that's why, again, I think if you put two-way guys with high motor and some size, like, you make things easier for AD. I think ultimately AD wanting to have another center, I think, is about easing his plate and the burden on him. And he carries, like, he has more touches than last season. They've increased his role, and he's still, at the end of the day, like, now Vando's back, that there's a little bit less trust on him, but like a lot of these lineups, he's supposed to carry defensively. And it's funneling things to AD, and that's just a huge part. Like, most stars aren't there's a reason why there aren't a lot of two-way stars in like the top 15, top 20. A lot of those guys are one-way players, and basically all of them are like offensive one-way players, or like average defensively. There are very few guys who are elite on both ends. I would say AD, Giannis, and I'm sure I'm missing, Shea is a good defender. Jason Tatum's a good defender. I don't want to miss anybody. Ant can be a good defender. So, like, there are other guys, but also some of those guys are perimeter guys. Like, there's a different workload carrying it in the paint. And even Giannis has a Brook Lopez next to him. AD does not have a Brook Lopez next to him. He would love to have a Brook Lopez next to him. So I think part of it's like age and wear and tear and bulking up and weighing more. But part of it's also just, there is an element of like some nights he doesn't play as hard as he could, and some nights I think it's understandable. Some nights it's not. King Wag, would you give two? Thank you for the super chat. Would you give 2 firsts for Miles Turner and Neesmith? So Neesmith is making, I've looked this up before. He's making 11. So you're talking about 31. So that would be about Rui, Gabe, and a minimum for Turner and Neesmith, I guess. I mean, so I've said this before. I don't think that the Lakers are going to give up both first-round picks. Barring like a De'Aaron Fox or maybe a Walker Kessler being like Fox, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of like how available he actually is. There's some uncertainty, like, would they even trade him to the Lakers, their bitter rival? I said this after the 2 games in Sacramento. The Kings pregame video, maybe it was a Lakers specific thing, it probably was, but even so, in their pregame video, they had Doug Christie punching Rick Fox in the face, and the crowd was going wild. So like the uppercut, if you guys remember the uppercut in the 2002 preseason, after the 2002 Western Conference Finals series, that I want to say it was like the preseason finale was Lakers Kings as like a hyped up matchup, and the Kings had their new jerseys that they got rid of the old ones, and Rick Fox and Doug Christie got into it, and Christie hits him with an uppercut, and the Kings played that, and the crowd went wild, and already, like, that was kind of around the time the Fox buzz had started in terms of him potentially being available. That was actually right when the Athletic article dropped. And I remember just thinking, like, I don't see how they're trading him to Lakers with like how much they hate the Lakers. Like, you can make a case the Kings, I mean, I think the Celtics are at the top of the list, the Clippers, and then outside of like Celtics and Clippers, Kings might be number 3 in terms of like Laker hate. So that outside of Fox and outside of maybe Kessler, if like, I don't know who's on AD's list in terms of the setters he wants. I'm sure he has a list. If Kessler's at the top of it or near it, maybe they're willing to give up 2. But in general, I'm operating under the assumption they're not giving up 2. And so I would do this. I don't think the Lakers would, but I would. Eeg, is DeAndre Hunter available? Vando, Gabe, salary match. I'm not quite sure. He's been having a pretty good year. One issue, as I've said on here before, if Vando's in a deal, Lakers are going to have to attach a first. And that's like separate of whatever the other player is worth. I think DeAndre Hunter is worth at least a first based on how he's played this season. And then I'm going to assume they don't love the Gabe contract. So I think this potentially is going to be a 2 firsts for Hunter, given you're giving up Vando and Gabe. Now, and it's funny because like we just talked about how good Vando looked, but like there's still a perception of Vando of what he is in the playoffs and like the contract and the injury history. So I think like, as I say, two things can be true at once. I think for the Lakers and like what they need, he has a lot of value, and that's a tough contract, I think, to trade. But like from a league-wide perspective, I don't think teams are like gnawing at themselves to try and get Jared Vanderbilt. I think he's probably a guy Lakers have to ride out at least the rest of this season and then maybe explore in the offseason depending on how things go. Patrick Murphy, thank you for the super chat. Rui has great physical tools and seems like a good dude, but seems lost on the court a lot of the time. Feel like he's the next one gone. I do think that's the one, the way that this is trending. Thank you for the super chat. I mean, it's really just like at some point it's just like a math situation, and it's Rui and Gabe because Max is too important. He's earned that starting shooting guard spot. I think even if you get like a Lonzo or a Bruce Brown, I think you probably have to keep Max starting with the way that he's playing. DFS, you're not trading. You traded for him. You invested a lot. Like it wouldn't really make sense. And then in terms of other mid-size, like they don't have other mid-size salary unless it's Austin, but they're not trading Austin or very unlikely to trade Austin. So with that, it's just like from a numbers perspective, unless they're doing a smaller trade for Kessler or for someone else, and it's Wood, it's JHS, it's Jackson, it's Cam. Outside of that, it would have to be Rui or Gabe. And realistically, to add someone of consequence, it would have to be Rui or Gabe. And between the two, Rui has more trade value and he has the higher salary. So I think Rui, I still think Gabe's more likely to be traded between the two, but it's probably close to 50-50 if the Lakers make a trade for like trade one of those. I hope you get what I'm saying. Shmugan, does Christian Wood still exist, or is he collective delusion that we had for a few months last season? Where is he? He's with the team right now. He was just in the locker room in San Francisco. He was laughing and smiling. He's always in a good mood. Always has like kind of a sly smile on his face. But I know the guys love him, and you know they think highly of him. But yeah, I've said it before, like I'm kind of operating under, I would not expect, I'm not saying he's not going to play this season, but I'm kind of moving forward as like he's like, I think an expendable player that could be dumped at the deadline as like a throw-in. Jason Sutton, so have we finally got the Miami Gabe from the postseason a couple of years ago? I'm starting to think Gabe is no longer a guy you should consider trading, or should I not get ahead of myself? It's a good question. I wouldn't get ahead of yourself, because if you look at Gabe's splits and the trends throughout his career, he has been a relatively inconsistent player, especially as a shooter. I think the defense and effort are always there. Like that's how he makes that's his bread and butter. That's how he's in the league. But the shooting has varied week to week, month to month, season to season with Gabe. So I think the larger sample size is he's like a below average 3-point shooter. This year he started at 23%. I had the stat 23% over his first 22 games. Then I think the next 15, 16, and that was like 2 games ago, he was at like 41%. So is he going to shoot 41% the rest of the season? I'm skeptical of that in terms of his 3-point shooting. If he does, then he is outperforming his contract. Like even at 6'1", 6'2", whatever he is, a 40% 3-point shooter and a plus defender on the perimeter, like that guy's worth more than $11 million. So I'm with you in that. I think if we were having this conversation a month ago between Gabe and Rui, I think at the time it was a no-brainer. Like, try to keep Rui and move Gabe, unless it's like you have to put Rui in the trade to make the money work and it's a clear upgrade. Now I think it's kind of becoming the opposite, where I think between the two, Gabe kind of fits more of this Lakers identity and what they need. My one concern with Gabe is I outside of the potential, there's 3 concerns. 1 is the injury history. 2 is the size. I just think that there are certain matchups where it's not even his fault. I think he's often in the right position. He's often trying. He has good technique, good footwork, hands up. physicality. He fouls a lot in a good way, I think, but he's still 6'1", and there's a limit. Like, go back to the 2020 team. Avery Bradley and Rondo were exceptions, although those guys, I mean, Avery Bradley was, for his generation, one of the best perimeter defenders, especially pound for pound. Rondo could amp it up to a certain level defensively, and going back to like Boston Prime, he was a plus defender. But those guys I felt like played with a certain level of force, and like, again, like Avery Bradley, I think was at a different level compared to Gabe in terms of just like his career. A lot of people would say Avery Bradley is like the best perimeter defender in the league for certain seasons. Like I never quite saw it to that level, but that was a thing that was out there. And then everyone else was 6'5" and above, and it was really hard to pick on Lakers defenders or find mismatches because everyone was good defensively and everyone was big. And so Gabe fits with a certain level of physicality and defense, but he's ultimately small. So I do think if you could flip, wave your magic wand and money isn't a thing. If you could flip Gabe for Bruce Brown or Alonzo Ball, and then you could flip Rui for a center, that's kind of like the best of both worlds, where you get a wing-sized ball handler in a Bruce Brown, Lonzo, and then you get another center that's better than Jackson / Christian / Trey. And that's like the best of both worlds, where you get the center that AD wants, a guy that could play next to him or man second units. And then you also get a guy who can do some of what Gabe can do offensively, not the same level of shooter of like the good Gabe. Maybe on average ends up being similar, but then defensively they're bigger. They fit more with the identity as like switching across like all the perimeter positions and not being able to be picked on, because Lonzo's 6'5", 6'6", Bruce Brown 6'4". It's harder to pick on those guys, and they both have strong bases. So that would be my one thing with Gabe is like, or my three things are the injuries, the inconsistent shooting historically, and even this season, and then also just the size. But between the two, I think Gabe's been outplaying Rui lately, and I think you can make a case that he fits more with the identity. Thank you for the super chat again. JJ's game plan is starting to really work, thank God. Yes, and this is a good point, and this is something I kind of regretted not touching on more in the Boston game, and probably tonight's show as well. Like, I think JJ's been doing a great job defensively with the game plan. I think he's made some really good decisions. You saw different coverages against both teams. Talked about mixing in some zone. I think the lineups and the rotation have been better, and I think he's got a really good pulse on the team. And I think you've even heard guys kind of talking more about the game plan and more about how important it is to execute it. And I think in a way that's kind of co-signing JJ and the coaching staff in not necessarily in a way that they weren't earlier in the season, but there certainly were stretches where they were not on the same page as we go back to early December, the Miami loss, the Minnesota loss, and some of the ups and downs. It does feel like they're more on the same page, and there's more of a trust and a bond and more of a rapport there that naturally there's not going to be earlier in the season to the same extent. And that's just how a season goes. The longer you go, as long as you're winning, things are relatively kumbaya, like you continue to bond and go to a different level. So I think JJ and the coaching staff deserve a lot of credit. I think offensively, they've been more organized the last couple of games. They've been running, I think, better actions. I think the spacing's been better. I think the process has been better. I think defensively, I think the countering has been better. And I mentioned some of the scram switching and some of the things, like they have a plan and the players are locked in and executing it. So I think JJ deserves his flowers for the last couple of games and in general, the way that this team is trending. Rafael Delgado, thank you for the super chat. I feel like they should have done the Turner trade years ago. Amen, brother. I'm with you. I felt they should have done it. Well, they got close. They got to the 1 yard line. It got to the ownership level, as Shams and I reported at The Athletic back in 2022, entering the 2022-23 season. They were right there with Indiana. It was at the ownership level, and ultimately LA decided to bow out, and they make the 2023 trade deadline trades, and they make the conference finals. But if we're ranking Turner versus Vando and D'Lo. You could have still made the Rui trade, so that was a separate thing. But turning Russ into Vando and D'Lo, and I mean, it's like, I guess if you look at it this way, you turned Russ into and you technically also had Bamba and Beasley, but they, did not manage those assets well. But you turned Russ into D'Lo and Vando, and then D'Lo into DFS. So you really turned Russ into Vando and DFS. I think I would argue that Turner is still the best player of the three, but you could argue that the addition of the second player maybe ultimately edges it toward the current path. But you also would have had Buddy Hield. I think he's been ultimately overrated throughout his career. Is like he's still a good to great shooter. I would say great. I don't want to downplay it. Like he's a great shooter, but it feels like in big moments, like he hasn't really had the like stretch as like he's not like the Clay Steph that maybe he was kind of billed to be by some. So, I think that there's tiers to it. There's levels to it. But I don't know. I mean, I'm generally with you. I think they should have made that trade back in early 2022. I think there's a case they would have been a 50+ win team, and you don't have to have the second half turn around and surge toward the playoffs and that, the kind of sprint. And remember, LeBron had his foot situation. So, and then he rushed back to play for the playoffs. And, I think from a process perspective, it probably would have been better to just do the Turner trade, but you could argue it ended up working out better. Benny takes on. Thank you for the super chat. Miles Turner is available pending free agent. What is a realistic price versus too much of an overpay? I think I've talked about this a little bit, but to reiterate, I would say I think it's going to be a first plus probably another asset. I think a realistic price is probably a first and a second. I think a first and a swap, depending on the year, because I think closer, like 2026 and 2028 are probably more valuable swaps than like 2030, for example. Arguably, a swap might be a first and a swap might be a little bit too much for me because you also have to pay him this summer. I think ideally a first is like a fair price. I think I'd probably do a first and a second, and then if they don't want to take that, I guess 2 second, like a first and 2 seconds is the most I would do. I would rather do 2 seconds than a swap because you just want to be careful with the swaps later on. But that is like kind of your all-in move in terms of you do still have an extra first, but I don't think they'd want to trade it in that case. And like, I don't think they'd want to completely empty the asset cupboard. So that's their primary move, but I think it could be worth it. Winston McCarthy, thank you for the super chat. Max, AD, Dorian, LeBron, Reeves, and Vando are all playoff rotation players, smart players who don't make mistakes. D'Lo wasn't, and I don't think Rui is. I largely agree with you. I would say I think the first five are. I think with Vando, we have to see how he is rest of the season in terms of health. I also think there are ways you can counter the way that he is used offensively that like the Lakers aren't the first, like they're not the first team to try to use a non-spacer this way. And there are counters defenses can do. I think ultimately they can figure it out and still make him a useful offensive player or just like a not like player that's played off the floor. But I would say in general that, like I largely agree with you. I think with Max, there's an unproven element of we've seen at times he's made some late game mistakes and he's 21. He's never really been a big part of a playoff run. So I want to see what that looks like. I have confidence in him and I've held my Max stock and things are great on Max Christie Island. Like we've built a bunch of infrastructure. The cash is flowing and there's a bunch of skyscrapers and things are going great on Max Christie Island. AD, Dorian, LeBron, Austin, I have no concerns with. I think those four are all proven playoff guys. D'Lo, we know about the history. Don't need to rehash that. And then Rui, things much more hit or miss as well. And that I've kind of made the Rui D'Lo parallels in terms of their floor being so low. There's like random stuff flying around my room. I don't know what's going on. And you know, to that point, like I think that there are some questions about the floor and the ceiling. Like the ceiling's high with Rui, but the floor is equally as low. Eeg, thank you for the super chat. Vando is a proven playoff offensive nightmare. So here you get the opposite end of proven playoff guy. Him in a corner is 5v4. Him as DHO threat works way better with a better shooting team. Can't dribble, playmaking much improved, but still sketchy. Boost his value, then sell. To your point, in terms of boosting value and then selling, I don't think the Lakers have enough time to boost it. I don't think they can boost his value in the next week and a half. I think people are just going to be like, cool, he was healthy for 2 weeks. Like, let's see him be healthy for 2 years. So you can maybe boost his value going to the offseason or maybe like early next season or middle of next season. But I don't think a week and a half of Vando playing is going to all of a sudden have all these suitors for him. Now, that could work to the Lakers' advantage because right now he's such a sunk cost from an asset perspective. Maybe they can't trade him and he does provide the boost that they need him to provide, and things are great, and like it ends up kind of being a blessing. So I think that's certainly, to your point, like there are ways to counter it, and I think like just like teams counter with Draymond and the way, like, you know, there are some similar ways that LA is using Vando to how Draymond is using Golden State as a non-spacer. And with Draymond, it was like he has Steph, he had Clay, he had Kevin Durant. So you have like the three, I mean, arguably the two best shooters ever. And at one point, another guy who was like a top 10, top 5 shooter in the league, whatever. So you can get away with the non-spacing and having him screen and dribble handoff and all this stuff when you have those guys flying around screens, shooting from whatever angle and constant motion. LA doesn't play offense like that, and they don't have that level of shooting. Even Dalton has like been an elite catch and shoot spot up guy, but he has struggled shooting off of screens outside of like that week and a half stretch he had earlier in November. So they don't have like that level of shooter, and that complicates the Vando thing a little bit. And again, teams are going to counter. There's always counters to everything, and then you have to counter. But with Vando, there's only so many counters you can do other than him stepping out and like actually being able to make some threes. And we'll see if he can ultimately add that to his game. So I'm kind of more on your side in terms of I think there are still some playoff questions with Vando that have to be figured out, but the Lakers have time to do that. Michael D, to be honest, if 1 versus 2 first is the breaking point on the Kessler deal, I'm doing it. I doubt they get anyone as good with either of those picks. I'm actually starting to lean this way. The more I've thought about it, like Kessler, especially if you're giving up JHS and you're not giving up Dalton or you're not giving up a rotation player, I just like you hope. I mean, we'll see what ends up happening with those first in terms of where they're at, but I just think Kessler, like I think people are sleeping on how good Kessler actually is, like now, let alone what he could grow into. They're like, I think honestly, Minnesota really screwed up with the whole Gobert situation. Like they could have just had Kessler instead of Gobert, and I think they'd be in a much better position financially. They could have kept Towns. Imagine like Towns and Kessler together. Like I think he's just straight up better than Gobert. I don't know if it's like a hot take, but yeah. I mean, certainly on the offensive end, he's better. Defensively, you could still maybe argue Gobert, although I think we like Gobert's a proven commodity, arguably in a negative way. I think Kessler, we still have to see how he performs in the playoffs. But yeah, I'm actually leaning more toward just being like, screw it, put both picks in if you have to. Ricky Burt, AD has to be stronger than the big he's playing. That's a fair critique, fair observation. That kind of is true. Like if you look at the bigs that are stronger than him, he tends to struggle unless his jumper's falling. So you're not necessarily wrong. Harry Chinani, Vando, thank you for the super chat. Vando back is a huge plus. I just worry there is going to be a forward clog and JJ will have a hard time managing minutes of Rui, DFS, Vando, but we saw Vando playing the 5 today in place of Jackson. Yeah, so I think as currently constructed, Vando's going to start taking... It's going to be Rando. random guy on the floor. Vando taking some of the minutes of Jackson and Dalton. They're going to play so Rui will be like the weaker defender in the rotation. Jackson and Dalton will be schemed out a bit. Rui will play his certain role. DFS will continue to get ramped up a bit, and then Vando will be ramped up, and then you'll probably have an 8-man rotation. I'm going to assume Rui's going to go back to starting, even though I think that's a mistake. 80 LeBron, Rui, Max, Austin, and then Vando, DFS, Gabe, and then that 9th guy can be Dalton or Jackson, depending on the night. So that's probably your 9-man rotation until you make a trade. But I agree. You only have 144 front court minutes. 70 of those are going to LeBron and AD. So already half of your front court minutes are gone. And you have 74 minutes to disperse between Rui, DFS, Vando, Jackson, Dalton. And that's to say nothing of potentially playing Max or Austin at the 2, which we have seen. I mean, at the 3, which we have seen in certain lineups. So it's like that. I just named 7 dudes for 74 minutes. That's hard to find, like that balance. So I don't envy JJ with that. Although again, I would prioritize it. DFS. I think Rui probably will play more than Vando, but yeah, I don't know. It's tough. It's tough. Ricky Burt, problem is not too many sellers have what we need. That's a good point. And really, I think the other problem right now is there are more buyers than sellers. So sellers can ask for more. If you look at it, there are not many teams that are just like tearing it down, tanking for Cooper Flag. It's less than 10. And you could argue the other 20 or 22, whatever teams are all either looking to make small moves or looking to make big moves. Some of them can't because of the second apron, luxury tax, some of their financial constraints. But I would say whatever the number of sellers is, there's at least like 4 to 5 more buyers, if not even more. And that's kind of a problem for this market. BLC, have to be careful. Adding new pieces might affect chemistry. That's a big part. Thank you for the super chat. That's certainly a part of this and a factor that you always have to factor in is like a guy's character. Are they going to accept the role that you are proposing? I think most of the guys that have been attached to the Lakers, like Walker Kessler, Robert Williams, Jakob Poeltl, if we now throw in Miles Turner, Bruce Brown, Lonzo Ball, like I don't think those guys have I don't want to say they don't have ego, because I think every player has ego to an extent, but like I think they all have like relatively reasonable self-awareness of like what their job, like all those guys are role players, and most of those guys are plus defenders, if not all of them. And I think to be a plus defender consistently, you have to buy into being a role player, and unless you're an elite 80 Giannis type, whatever, but you have to buy into being a role player and like buy into doing the dirty work and doing the little things. And like, so I think that, and that's another thing with me where it's like, okay, if you go get Zach LaVine's the big one that like, look, he's having a great season. I'm not going to deny it. He's still a massive defensive liability. He still has a troubling injury history in terms of multiple knee surgeries. And like, that's just like a red flag. And you got the contract that's really hard for LA to match. But Zach LaVine's never been a guy who's done the little things. And like, even if we say the offense offsets the defense, it's still like, to be a championship team, you can't have a guy just like mailing in the defensive end. And we have yet to see him commit and be consistent enough on that end that like, I just have legitimate concerns about what that would look like in May basketball. So that's a guy that I think could be a great fit from a talent perspective, a skill perspective. Like he has the talent to do it, but has not done it, both like in terms of being in the playoffs and being a defender in the playoffs. That like, I would have more concerns with that of like, can this guy be the number 3 and also accept that sometimes Austin's going to have the ball. Maybe Austin has an advantageous matchup. He's cooking. Now I'm the number 4, and I have to try defensively in a different way and switch across all these positions. And like, I need to be locked in a way I've never been defensively. That would be my concern with a guy like that. The other guys, especially if they're defensive minded guys tend to be more self-aware just because they embrace that side of the ball that like is the unglamorous side. It's the dirty work side. It's like the attention, like to be a good defender, you got to study the scouting report. You got to watch film. Like there's a lot of things that go into it. There are some guys that are just naturally gifted, but for the most part, you have to be pretty cerebral. So I think those guys are like more the type of guys I'd be trying to add. Some of the more offensive minded guys, I think I think there's a little bit more concern in terms of like them buying into a smaller role. Because anyone, unless again, it's like a top 20 guy, which outside of maybe Fox, that's like the only guy that's in that conversation available. All the other guys like are going to be likely downsizing their offensive role coming to the Lakers. There's no one that's coming in that's like going to have this giant offensive role. Even a Levine, it's going to be a much smaller role than Chicago. So like, can he adapt to that? Can a Brandon Ingram do that? Can a Jimmy do that if they got like, so, and I think there's some concerns with that stuff, right? So that's my spiel on like offense versus defense and sort of adding new pieces and how those guys fit. Baby father, my Boricua brethren, nice defensive Lakers these games. Yeah, I mean, Lakers defense has been really good. Thank you for the super chat. Lakers defense has been really good the last couple games. And in general, it's been trending in the right direction. RGN Cal 4, trade out 2029 first for 3 firsts. OKC or Brooklyn, thoughts? If you could do it, I would do it. Now, I think I'd prefer to trade 2031 than 2029 because I think if the Lakers have a down period, it's probably more likely to be like between 2027 and 2029 than it is to be later, in my opinion, based on the contracts, based on the way they're set up. I think it's more like the end of this decade versus the beginning of the next one in terms of when their most likely down period would be, unless they pull a rabbit out of the hat with another star. Maybe they do. So I would prefer to trade 2031, but if you could flip one of those 2 picks for multiple firsts a la Phoenix and then go maybe flip 2 of those firsts for something else, I would assume, like, for example, let's say, because one thing is like, if you're trading 1 first for 3, you just, if we think about this critically, that team that is giving up the 3 firsts is basically saying, we think these 3 firsts are equal to like this caliber, these caliber of first round picks are equal to one of your first round picks, right? So I believe it was the Utah assistant GM said that the 3 picks they gave up to Phoenix, they're like, we know these are not going to be number 1 picks. If you look at the teams, the years, their situations, these are not going to be number 1 picks. There is a chance that the 2031 pick from Phoenix is going to be a number 1 pick. So for them, they felt it was worth the risk of maybe one of those picks is a lottery pick or a top 10 pick or whatever. But they were like, we would rather take the risk of this 2031 pick being the number 1 pick or being a top 5 pick, whatever, rather than these picks that are projecting to be in the 20s. So I say all that to say, like, you got to think like the caliber of pick you're going to get for in terms of getting 3 picks back is going to be lower. So if you turn around and go to Utah and say, hey, I mean, one, they just did the opposite of this. So they clearly value the more valuable picks rather than the lesser picks. But let's just entertain this. You go to Utah and you say, hey, we just got these 2 picks from OKC. We got these 2 picks from Brooklyn. Give us Walker Kessler. They're going to say, no, we want the 2031 or the 2029, whichever one you didn't trade. And then we'll take the kind of crappier first and maybe something else. So I think one thing with this is like you do from a volume perspective, of course, it's better to have more firsts in theory, but you got to think about the quality of the firsts. And I do think the Lakers 2029 and 2031 have a lot of value because, quite frankly, Laker fans aren't going to want to hear this, but people think the Lakers are going to be bad then. and they have, LeBron's going to be in his mid to late 40s, whenever, depending on the year. AD is going to be in his late 30s. People are betting against the Lakers. They want those picks. So the Lakers can use that to their advantage, though, because those picks should have more value than the average first round pick. And if they do end up flipping them, maybe you flip them for 2, and those picks are like more valuable than the ones that Phoenix got, and that gets you into the Kessler, Turner, whoever conversation. So that's another spiel on the picks. I think I'm going to probably end here. I might answer a couple from the chat because I did get a lot of super chats, so have not been able to dip into the chat yet, but gone about an hour and a half, so we'll be wrapping soon. Honcho, thank you for the super chat. Jovan, how's the Utah trade situation looking? Do they want both picks and DK, or do you think 2 first rounders, 2 second rounders, and JHS might be enough? Also, any news on Seawood? No news on Seawood. I've asked about Seawood multiple times, and frankly, JJ's either like chuckled a couple times, or he just looks at PR and says, we don't have an update, right? And then they say no. So I think Seawood is, until we hear an update, operate with like, it's AD and Jackson, and that's it. As far as your question, or your first question, I think they would do 2 picks in DK. I think they would, but I think that's an overpay. 2 firsts, 2 seconds in JHS. I think they probably do that as well. I also think that's a bit of an overpay. I mean, I think if I'm the Lakers and I'm putting both firsts on the table, you're not getting any more assets from me. Like you know, if you want to take a first out and I'll give you a swap or a swap in a second or something, that's different. But I'm not giving you both firsts and both second round picks. I think that's just a little bit too steep of a price, and that's just Utah kind of, running one over on the Lakers. So I think they would do either one of those trades. I would I would not do the first one, and I would not do the second one if I was the Lakers. Again, if you're giving up 2 firsts, you're not getting a second round pick or a swap from me. Like those are your assets. And then I might even say, like, if the Lakers somehow think JHS is salvageable, maybe I even say take Christian Wood and we're keeping JHS. Now, I think in terms of who could contribute more, Christian Wood, even with the injury uncertainty, I'd rather bet on that than JHS. So I would do, like, if you're going to do that, just do 2 firsts in JHS and get it over with and just do it. Okay, let's dive into the chat for a few questions here. Lakers media member says donate $500 to Jovan. You know what? I'm not going to stop you guys, but I appreciate any super chats. Orange Sunset says just get Vooch and Io and save the first. You're gonna have to give up a first for Io. The sumo is gonna cost a first. Just so you know. So I think this package, if depending on, especially if he's making 7, Vooch is making 20, so it's 27. It's basically gonna be Rui and Gabe. I think you're gonna have to attach assets for Rui and Gabe. And so I think this is probably a first and 2 seconds type pick or type trade, to be honest. Okay, you're saying just save 1 first instead of 2. Okay, I misunderstood what you were saying. Then sure. Got it. You're comparing it to Kessler. Jay, no, AD wants a defensive center. This is the tricky part because Vooch has been a name that's been thrown around, and I get it. He's a former All-Star. He's averaging 20 points a game. He's having a career year shooting, and people gravitate towards the offensive end. The offensive end is sexy. The defensive end, as we were just talking about the role players, it's not as sexy. It's not as glamorous. But Vooch and Valanciunas are 2 of the worst defensive centers in the league statistically. They have cement blocks for feet. I was watching some Vooch defensive film, and he just gets blown by and like he's big, so he can occasionally rotate over and block a shot. He's got some strength and can be a solid post defender in certain matchups. But these got like I would say these guys make Jackson Hayes look like he's Wilt Chamberlain out there. So maybe that's exaggeration, but you get where I'm going. Like, for all the complaints that people have with Jackson Hayes, I think they would have far more complaints with the Valanciunas or Vucevic defensively. Lakers. Is this the official Lakers account? Tuning in. Bad joke. Tier 1, Kessler Turner. Tier 2, Pirtle Capella. Tier 3, Vooch, Rob Williams, Jonas. I largely agree with you. I personally would put Robert Williams in tier 2 because the other two guys you have him with are bad defenders. And I think, at least from a rim protection standpoint, he's a better defender than Pirtle and Capella. He does come with injury concern. And Pirtle, I think, is a more... He's a little bit bigger and weighs more and is stronger and can, I think, kind of withstand more in terms of like guarding bigger guys in the post and stuff. So like, Pirtle's a cinder block, but I would put Robert Williams in tier 2 and then that would be my list. I would honestly have it tier 3 and then Jonas versus Vooch. I actually think there's a gap there. I would probably put Jonas tier 4, honestly. Ali Razivi, appreciate the content. Your top trade that happens from your point. Are you talking for the Lakers or just in general? And are you talking like what I think is going to happen or the player I would target or like the type of trade I would target? Because I have different answers for all those. Orange Sunset. My fear is JJ won't want to play Kessler with AD and any non-spacing player. I hear you, and it is one of my fears too. However, what I will say is if the Lakers give up 2 first-round picks for Walker Kessler or like Dalton and a first for Walker Kessler, JJ is almost going to have to play him a certain amount because it's like you can't trade all that for that. Like, I'm not going to say there are scenarios in which guys or teams trade for a player and then the coach falls out of favor or like they don't fit their scheme and it gets a little messy. But I would assume that JJ has said he and Rob, like we haven't spoken to Rob in a while, but JJ says he and Rob are communicating about the deadline. They're obviously aware of AD's request and whatnot. So I think that the combination of the potential cost of getting Kessler and how much they'd be investing of either 2 future firsts or Dalton and a first, and AD's public request and the pressure he's putting on JJ in the front office, JJ, if they get a center, that combination to me would guarantee Kessler. Like, I don't see him playing, even if he comes off the bench, I don't see him playing under 24 minutes a night. I think he's probably a high 20s guy starting or coming off the bench. Jason Jimenez, we should have never traded Zubats. Yeah. I mean, that at the time that was when I was covering the Clippers. And I just remember being like, I do not like, I was aware of Zubats and I'd seen him play for the Lakers, but then I dug into the film and I was like, I don't understand this trade. Like, why did the Lakers just do this? And he's now, you could argue like in that archetype of like the exact type of big you would want next to AD. The Sir 420 Yo-Yo Jovan, great work as always. Thank you. How likely or unlikely do you think it is we could get a deal for Turner done? I would say unlikely. A couple reasons that I touched on a little bit earlier. One, that I don't even know if he's for sure available. I just talking to someone I trust and that's in the know with these things, a league source, they told me that from what they've heard, there's been some buzz that Turner could be available because of the contract situation. It's more of like a low key quiet situation. Obviously, I talked about it, so now I guess it's not low key quiet, but so there's still some lack of clarity as to like how available he actually is and what that price would be. Then there's a matter of what the price is if the Lakers would want to meet that price, and Indiana would likely need a center back in some. Maybe it's a 3-team trade. Maybe Rui goes somewhere else. It would probably have to be Rui. Turner's making just under 20. So Rui would probably have to be the base, but maybe you do a 3-team trade where Rui goes somewhere else, Turner comes to the Lakers, another player goes to Indiana. I'm trying to think of like you could do something like could you do Pirtle, right? Like Pirtle's basically making the same amount of money as Turner. Could you do some type of 3-team trade where Pirtle goes to Indy, Turner goes to LA, and then Rui goes to Toronto, and it probably costs you, I think it probably costs you a first to Indiana and then 2 seconds to Toronto, something like that. Indiana might want more, like, I don't know, maybe it's like a swap in a second to Toronto and a first and a second to Indiana, but like it's going to cost you, especially because like Toronto doesn't necessarily need to trade Pirtle for Rui. They're not like, he doesn't really fit their timeline necessarily. So that's just off the top of my head, like one matching salary. You could do Vooch to Indy. That's kind of an interesting one. You could, again, maybe but I would say unlikely for now, but if he is available, I think LA has the assets to get him. So I think depending on how things develop over the next 10 days, I'll have a better read on this. Kenny Bassano says, what's your honest take about Kessler Jovan? He's my number one trade target. I think, I don't know if it's because he plays in Utah. I don't know if it's because he is a white 7'2" setter and like kind of looks a little awkward sometimes, but like dude is a beast on both sides of the ball. I was watching film on him against Dallas and Denver, and he's blocking Derek Lively alley-oop dunk attempts. He's blocking Jokic in the post. He's blowing up lob passes. He's covering all, like he's really good at the no man behind kind of soft hedging that the Lakers would do in terms of kind of being up to touch, but then retreating. And he's so big that when both of his arms are spread, he can recover and contest if the downhill ball handler is going to shoot a floater or something, but he can also then, recover backwards and block the lob, or if somehow the ball gets past him, like then recover and block a shot. So I think the defense is elite. Of course, there's going to be some matchups where speed or shooting can be a little bit troublesome, but that's where you downsize, go with 80 at the 5. And then offensively, he's already playing in a system, like in some ways kind of similar, where like Markkanen's a shooter. John Collins is an improved shooter, but like teams don't always treat him that way. So like they're playing kind of this weird funky front court where it's him, Collins, and Markkanen, and he's largely operating around the elbows and as a screener, or he's in the dunker spot. And like that's exactly how I think LA would use him. And I think it would be a seamless fit. And from the dunker spot, he's really good at crashing, diving for cuts. So he gets dump off passes, he gets cuts, he gets offensive rebounds. He is an elite finisher, elite offensive rebounder. So I think based on age, based on contract, based on Lakers needs and stated needs from their best player and franchise player, Walker Kessler checks all the boxes. He's 23. He still has another year left on his rookie deal. It's going to be an astronomical price. It is going to be the highest price of basically anyone realistically attached to the Lakers, but I think there's a reason for it, and I think he would be a great fit. And regardless of what happens, whether they keep LeBron and AD moving forward, or whether LeBron retires this year or next year, or AD, whatever happens in the future, I think like you see the mistake of losing Zubats. I've compared Kessler to Zubac. I think Kessler's ceiling honestly could be higher than Zubac's because I think defensively he can be even better. I think he's better than Zubac's, but on defense, but like offensively, he doesn't quite have the touch and the hook and like Zubac's can shoot a little bit. So yeah, that's my Kessler thoughts. Puppy Chow 302 says Turner is a more complete player than Kessler. In some ways, yes. I would argue, like, certainly the shooting is a huge element, and that unlocks so much offensively. So I don't want to downplay that. And I would say, like, from a space, if we're comparing spacing and defense, they're obviously much closer in terms of defense than like spacing, right? I would flip it though. Kessler's a much better rebounder than Miles Turner. Like it's not really close. So I think if you factor in, he's a better finisher, he's a better rebounder, and he's a better overall rim protector. Those three things are arguably more important, in my opinion. Kane Carter, Jovan, is there a difference between a good shooter like DFS or Clay having an off night versus a Vando having a bad shooting night affecting the team? I would say yes, in the sense of like, I think sometimes a bad shooter having a bad night can be a little discouraging in terms of like, you can't, like, the guys aren't stupid. They know who can shoot on the team, who can't. They know how teams defend. Like these guys are all smart, high level in terms of viewing the game. So if Vando is being sagged off and he airballs 3 threes in a row, like there's an element of like next time they're probably not swinging the ball to him. Whereas Clay can miss 7 shots in a row. If you get an open look for Clay, he's going to get the open look, and there's a good chance he's going to make it based on the law of averages. Where Vando, it's like that 4th shot could also be an air ball or a bad miss or whatever. So I do think like sometimes, and I think honestly it happened a lot with Russ, where it would be Russ would have these nights where he went 3 for 15 and like you all right, miss 4, miss 5, miss 6, miss 7. Like I think of that game in Sacramento, the cold as ice game, where I forgot what he finished, but like it felt like every miss kept like compounding on one another, and it was a little demoralizing offensively, because I think at some point your teammates go like, this is kind of wasting offensive possessions here, like letting this guy shoot. Like we got to run the offense elsewhere. So that I do think on some level that there's like a psychological element to that. Catching up. Okay. I just banned the spammer. Orange Sunset. I'll end on this one, and then I'm about to be at 2 hours. I do have some more work I got to do tonight, and I'm leaving in the morning for Charlotte. Got a nice 8.5 hour travel day, leaving at 12, getting in at 11:30 Eastern, which is 8:30 Pacific. So I'm going to wrap after this question. I think it's a good way to tie a bow on a lot of stuff we've talked about. Orange Sunset asks, Jovan, do you think JJ can talk 80 out of needing a starting center? No. No, because I think it's in some ways it's deeper than, I think it's 80's identity. And that was what was so clear to me in both the comments to Shams and the comments to us when I asked them about what do you see as the biggest advantage for you at the 4 versus at the 5, and then he went on this soliloquy about, I've always been a 4 until 2021. I had only played 4. I occasionally can play 5 at times, but I'm primarily a 4. That's when I feel most comfortable. That's how I see myself. Like, I think it's like deeper than just like basketball philosophy. I think like AD in his head is a 4. And I've made the counter argument that like if you described AD, if you took off the name Anthony Davis and you just looked at his statistical profile and his physical profile, that guy is a center in 2025. Like a guy who, with that size and that weight and that rebounding and that rim protection and that finishing inside, who also isn't really consistently shooting the ball well outside of, he's been shooting the ball better recently, but like in general, not really shooting the ball well outside of like 18 to 20 feet. That guy is a center in 2025. So I think those things are a little bit at odds in terms of his identity versus like what's probably best for the team. I would argue, like, I think what's best is having both looks and having the flexibility to, on a matchup by matchup basis, go like, because you could argue, depending, like I mentioned, imagine Kessler on Porzingis, but maybe Boston's a tough matchup for Kessler. But if you have, you have Vando, you have DFS, maybe Rui, depending on, like, if you get Kessler, you can keep Rui. You can put one of those guys on Porzingis, have AD help off, and you can still kind of get away with that style of defense by being a little bit smaller and a little bit more mobile. So like I believe more in like the flexibility of it. I don't mind AD playing the 4. I just think in 2025 he is not a full-time 4, and we have 4 years of evidence that like LA's used him at the 5. Part of it's also tough to kind of judge because they've had such bad centers that like we don't know what AD looks like next to a good center. We haven't seen it since probably 2020, maybe 2021, arguably, depending on how you felt about Marc Gasol, Andre Drummond, etc. So it's been at least like 4 years since we've seen AD with a good center outside of the All-Star team or Team USA. So I would like to see it, but I think if JJ was going to change his mind, it would have been in the summer. It would have been early in the season. And clearly, like, AD is set on playing the 4, at least more, maybe not full-time, but more. So I think that's what the Lakers are going to try and do. They're going to try and prioritize finding another center, and we'll see what type of center they get. Hope, for their sake, hopefully they get the right center, but we shall see. But with all that said, went over as always. Apologies to Mitch. You're going to have to listen to this whole thing for 2 hours. I'm sorry. You know who you are. And I want to give you all a big shout out. Late Night Gang. It is 12:20 a.m. Pacific time, and you guys are rocking with me. We've had consistently over 900 people in here. I appreciate you all. This channel, this stream continues to grow, and I'm excited to keep building this out. I got a new audio interface. I hope for those who have had some issues with my volume on the road, I hope this was good volume. I bought a new interface, basically similar to the one I have at home. So I've been investing more in the road setup, trying to get this as close to like my home studio as possible. Of course, don't got the purple lights, don't have the DSL camera, but maybe at some point I will get a second camera and travel with that. But thank you all so much for watching and listening. For those watching on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this video. For those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I will be back on Monday night after the Lakers-Hornets game. I will talk to you then. Thank you to the Late Night Gang.